Everybody can hear. Thank you very much for showing up. It's great to be here, as you all know. At our age, it's just great to be. It's important to watch out what you ask for, because a couple of months ago, I was talking to David Ellison, who many of you know and who often presents here, and you know, he asked me, well, what have you been doing? And I said, well, I was a news anchor and a TV reporter for 20 years. And he said, oh, that would make a wonderful talk for Open Circle. And I thought, really? Because the glory and glamour of all that disappeared for me about 25 years ago. But it did get me thinking as to, well, okay, why did I get into this crazy business of television and media? And I started thinking about that, and growing up, I loved science. I wanted to be a physicist, and until I discovered that I really didn't have that much of an aptitude for mathematics. So I always liked watching television, but I never had an ambition to get on TV. So I thought I'd better come up with a better title than Confusions and Conflicts of a Senior Something Wondering What the Heck Got Him Here. And I came up with Confessions of an International Media Man. I thought that would be a little more of a grabby title, and for seniors like us who are grasping for, you know, some kind of gossip. And if you are, you know, tune into the Netflix documentaries on Charlie Sheen. That's got a lot of it. Or Martha Stewart. That's much better than I can do. So that's my first confession. I really didn't get invited for the juicy stuff, you know. But I did show up as a media man, which is kind of an intermediary between, a go-between. And it satisfied my idealism and my curiosity, and it gave me a sense of purpose for about 20 years. I was born and bred in the US of A. I came of age in Canada. I ripened in Texas, and now I'm getting my dust on my heart here in Mexico, under this beautiful tree, and living in the legacy that this amazing woman, Neil James, has left Chapala and left the Lake Chapala Society for all of us to live under. It's really a privilege to be here, to speaking to you. Well, thankfully, I was not in the news business all my life. I roughly from the Montreal Summer Olympics of 1976 up until the Democratic National Convention of 1996. And I worked in 6 local media markets, 3 in Canada, Montreal, Charlottetown, PEI, and Toronto. And then 15 more years working in the US, reporting for affiliates in Austin, Boston, and Santa Maria, California, where I would often say, good evening, thank you for joining us in the news tonight. You remember, so do I. So I quit that business twice, once successfully. I got fired twice. I was let go, not for cause, just for cutbacks, you know. I never dropped the F-bomb on air or wound up in the newspaper with a DUI. You can call me lucky, I guess. The anchor chain did finally break for me, though, in 1996, and I started promoting safety and communication skills and leadership in oil and gas projects around the world, and mainly in West Africa and Angola and Nigeria. So I kind of redeemed myself. I finally got a real job when I was in my 50s, but you know, I waited. Better late than never. I've been a news junkie ever since my first job as a paper boy, back delivering the Chicago Tribune in Elmhurst, Illinois. But sadly, like you, I've seen journalism and the trust in journalism drop about 40 points since the days of Huntley and Brinkley and Walter Cronkite back in the post-Watergate 70s. So I know some of you are writing memoirs, and I am too, so this is a sketch of mine in 4 acts. First of all, the golden age from about 1946 to 1960. Then the crazy 60s are what I can remember about them, or what I care to remember about them. Life under maple leaves from 1970 to 1985. And then news you can use from the 80s and 90s. And this was a full 10 years before Will Ferrell and Ron Burgundy satirized that with Anchorman, which I found hilarious, naturally. Now, if you think or imagine that I know where things are headed in the future, you can think again. Because as we used to say in the news business, if it's news, it's news to me. It all began for me, we did say that. It was kind of a cynical business to be in, and I suppose it still is. It began for me right on the tip of the baby boom in the winter solstice of 1946. That baby boom of 76 million of us from 1946 to 1964. So if you would, please raise your hand if you are a baby boomer. Any baby? Oh. So this is where all the flowers went. Okay, great. So where are you all from? Proud Yankees? Raise your hands. Even if you're not so proud, that's okay. How about polite Canucks with your elbows up or elbows down? From the north, any dual citizens like me? Good. We got Europeans. Yes. Mexicanos. Bueno. Todos están bienvenidos. I just try to, in this age of discord and division and distrust, I'm trying to get the lay of the land so that we can be here in peace under this beautiful open circle that we have here. So back to the good old days. Like most of you, I think I was born at a very early age. It was the Cold War winter of 1946, and I was a people pleaser, I'll admit it. I was the firstborn, so Mom and Dad wanted to show off their adorable son. And by the time I was 4, I was actually able to recite the path that food takes from over the tongue, under the palate, past the epiglottis, and then around the larynx, down the esophagus, right into the stomach. And I think that it was the epiglottis that was the real showstopper. That's the flap there. So until television came along, like many of you, I suppose, I listened to radio programs like The Lone Ranger and The Shadow. Who knows what evil lurks in the minds of men? The Shadow knows. We neighborhood kids in Lafayette, Indiana, put on our plays in Clifford Delacroix's backyard. That was on the corner from our much more modest bungalow at 1710 Northwestern Avenue, down the road from Purdue, where my dad was teaching agricultural engineering right after the war. In fact, it was in Clifford's living room one day that I had my first glimpse of the device that would one day change my life. It was, I don't remember it that well, but I found out from ChatGPT. It was Tuesday, June 2nd, 1953. I had just finished the first grade. Dad came home early. I was 6. My sister Betsy was 4. And they all told us we were going over to the Delacroix for a surprise. Mr. Delacroix invited us up into his big living room, and there were all the neighbors and their kids gathered around looking at this box, this big brown box over in the corner that looked to me like it was a radio. It had dials on it and everything, except it had a screen about this size as well. And so we all gathered around. It was so small I couldn't see much. It looked to me like a parade. There was a carriage and some black horses, and somebody was waving, Big deal. Little did I know or care that a rather shy 19-year-old was the new Queen of England. I was less than impressed. I didn't suspect, though, that in 20 years I'd be trying to squeeze into that brown box myself to make a living. But I did. I remember the day not because of Her Royal Highness, but because of what happened when Clifford and I first went for rhubarb pie out in the kitchen, and then out back to explore the woods next door. And while the young queen, old enough to be my babysitter, only 13 years older, was comfortably regal riding in her carriage in Westminster, I was tramping around in the woods when suddenly, ow, I went down wailing in pain after I stepped on a rusty nail sticking out of a 2x4 that pierced my kid's sneaker. Well, my parents soon rescued me from metatarsal crucifixion, but that rusty point was the headline of the day. I got a tetanus shot from the family doctor who warned me about the dangers of lockjaw. Remember lockjaw? Your jaw's locked and you can never talk again. And it's not as bad as rabies, but it's pretty bad. And thanks to vaccinations, I didn't get that, and I didn't get polio later on. And I've been shooting off my mouth ever since, as you can tell. So began my up and down, painful career with the media and its painful message. That 1953 coronation in Westminster Abbey had an enormous effect. It drove mass adoption of television in Britain because in the UK, a lot of people bought their first television sets just so they could watch the coronation. Footage was flown across the Atlantic, and networks showed film of that ceremony the next day, and that's what we saw in Clifford's front room. It demonstrated how television would and could connect audiences to global events in real time. And the rest is history. In 1953, 50% of US households owned a television, but by 1960, 85% of households owned one, and it became just as dominant north and in Canada. In 1952, the Canadian government had created a national network as a public-private crown corporation with a dual role to both protect Canadian identity and regulate content, Canadian content, and to serve as a national broadcaster. Down in the US, private commercial networks dominated the airwaves in television just as they'd done in radio. So I'm sure you remember watching television back then. It was a kind of a family hearth. We all gathered around, and it was warm. It was a family thing that everybody could participate as. So when I was young, as a Cub Scout, we watched Texaco Star Theater with Mr. Television, Milton Berle. There was the Ed Sullivan Show called Toast of the Town. And by the way, if you haven't seen it on Netflix, don't miss the excellent documentary of the same name that's, I think, still running now. There was the Honeymooners with a pretty unwoke Ralph Cramden, Jackie Gleason, always threatening Alice, one of these days, pow, straight to the moon. But Alice always stood her ground, and I Love Lucy for the same thing. There was, for kids, Winky Dink. Did anybody remember Winky Dink? Yeah, Winky Dink was the first interactive kids TV show. They had a vinyl plastic screen that you'd stick onto the front of the TV, and then you could draw on that with crayons. And they sold 1.25 million Winky Dink kits the first year for 50 cents. But the show was canceled because kids were drawing directly on the screen without, without the vinyl, and parents were complaining, hey, they're ruining the TV set, so that didn't go. We watched Howdy Doody, The Little Rascals, The Three Stooges, and what 12-year-old boy can forget Annette Funicello on the Mickey Mouse Club? Sorry. After 1955, we danced to American Bandstand, and 1956, Elvis shook up Ed Sullivan 3 times in 1 year. I remember a chain-smoking Edward R. Murrow interviewing beautiful Marilyn Monroe live from her apartment on Person to Person. That was in television's golden age, and it was mine too, growing up privileged to be in a family with a TV set. But it kind of depended where you lived. I remember 1 year we vacationed down in Florida, and I was corrected, honey, when I ordered ice cream at the colored counter down in Fort Lauderdale. And I figured, colored, that meant strawberry, so that's where I went. But the fabulous 50s had a darker side. We hid under our desks, hoping to survive a nuclear blast from Russian ICBMs. In 1954, Ed Murrow confronted Senator McCarthy's Red Scare and saying, we cannot defend freedom abroad by deserting it at home. some things don't change, although they need to. I was 9 in 1955 when Emmett Till was brutally murdered in Mississippi, and my parents wouldn't let me see the front page of the newspaper that day. That year in Alabama, Rosa Parks stood her ground and started the Montgomery bus boycott with Martin Luther King. In October 1957, bleep, bleep, bleeps from Russia's first Sputnik satellite began the space race. Federal troops integrated Central High in Little Rock. I remember watching that. The Klan was still running the Old South. 50s were fine with me, but somehow something didn't seem quite right. Even though we had Fats Domino and Chuck Berry was bringing Johnny B. Good to white kids at our sock hops. So the times were certainly a changing by 1960, and that was the year I entered York High in the leafy Elmhurst suburb west of Sweet Home, Chicago. On to the shifting 60s. I graduated from the 8th grade after Mom, the dean, Mr. North, and I all agreed that I was not going to be a greaser with a spit curl. I still have a picture of that, with a ducktail imitating Elvis and James Dean or Marlon Brando. We all decided that I was going to straighten up and not be a wise guy anymore, and that intervention almost worked. On September 26th, the first Nixon-Kennedy debate was telecast, and it was the first ever on TV. Radio listeners thought sure that Dick Nixon he was the vice president at the time, that he'd won the debate. But television viewers saw that Kennedy's calm demeanor and his youthful style won the day, and it probably was true that perspiration on Nixon's upper lip changed the course of history. 10 days before that historic election, on October 25th, John Fitzgerald Kennedy himself made a stop at York High School for a rally that was supposed to begin at 9 o'clock, but it started at 10. I was a freshman, sweating high up in the bleachers that night as we stomped and sang, "Happy days are here again," until finally Kennedy raised the roof with a speech about the loss of U.S. prestige abroad. Well, all of us students in that gym were electrified that night, and I was so excited I ran out of the side door early to the corner where Kennedy's car was parked, and I elbowed to the front of the crowd just as the candidate was getting pushed into his limousine. And just as the door opened, I reached for his sleeve and I brushed it. I touched him. I was sure I did. And the limo drove away. Everybody was just shaking, electrified with excitement. Did I really, or was it somebody else's? All I know is that moment changed my life. I walked home that Indian summer Tuesday night, sure that I'd been touched by greatness. And it was a school night, but I sure could not sleep. Well, 2 weeks later, JFK squeezed out a victory, thanks to Mayor Daley in Chicago. And then on a freezing January inauguration day, his call echoed to ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And it was a new decade. I was 13. I thought, yes, we can change the world. And we tried. I got into student government, I played football, sang in choir, acted in plays during those 1,000 days of Camelot. John Glenn orbited the Earth in 1962. We escaped Armageddon in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and everything on TV looked pretty rosy for about 3 years, right up until one Thursday afternoon as I rushed to gym class and my friend Gary asked if I'd heard the news on November 22nd, 1963. Walter Cronkite couldn't bear to tell the country. Shock and grief traumatized the nation, and I think maybe it still does. We wept and saw our hopes die in Dallas and Dealey Plaza that day. The world flipped on that day, as it's flipped often since then, and that was the first time. I won't forget those lonely, bitter tears walking home that night. Network suspended programming for 4 days. On Sunday, millions saw Jack Ruby shoot Lee Harvey Oswald live on TV. Then on Monday, the world watched in black and white as a riderless horse led Kennedy's funeral. That was the moment when television eclipsed radio and newspapers to become the dominant medium for world events. But, as it so often does for the fortunate, life went on. The following February, the Beatles were mobbed at JFK Airport in New York and debuted on Ed Sullivan in February, watched by 73 million people. And everybody needed to hear, "She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah." And in June of 1964, I graduated from high school. 2 months later, the fishy Gulf of Tonkin resolution authorized President Johnson to send troops to Vietnam. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965, and the fall of 1964, I headed to Michigan State. Now, my aptitude test said that I would make a very good librarian. Obviously, advice that was not taken, otherwise I'd be an IT specialist, probably speaking a language that nobody understood. But I've always loved books, and the era of color television took over about 1966 as Cesar Chavez was uniting the farm workers in California, and the National Organization for Women was being formed in New York. In '67, the first Super Bowl was broadcast in living color. But that year, I spent in Aix-en-Provence, France, on a junior year program learning French and falling in love with the leggy blonde Gabrielle, who taught me how to use those familiar tu pronouns. Ça a été le coup de foudre, je ne pouvais rien faire autrement. You know, you're young, 19 years old. So on spring break that year, I remember I hitchhiked through Europe, and outside Munich, I trudged all alone through the Dachau concentration camp on a drizzly day, peering in 20-year-old gas chambers and ovens. I couldn't bring myself to take any pictures that day, but I still can feel the shivers. I hitchhiked behind the Iron Curtain to Berlin, crossing through Checkpoint Charlie onto Czechoslovakia, a couple of months before the Russians stomped out the Prague Spring. The summer of '67, I got back to the U.S. for my senior year. That was in San Francisco. That was the summer of love, the hippie summer of love, as the counterculture began to tune in and turn on. But for others, the summer of love meant burn, baby, burn, because black anger had boiled over, and so did the white backlash of fear. Newark went up in flames, 43 people died, and then 2 weeks later, 43 more in Detroit. During 1968, my senior year, Vietnam became the living room war as graphic combat footage aired every night. Soon the Stonewall Uprising in Greenwich Village would ignite the gay rights movement. '68 was a turning point around the world. Riots in France, the Prague Spring, the Tlatelolco student massacre in Mexico City. After the January Tet Offensive, Walter Cronkite said the war was a stalemate, and opinion shifted. LBJ said he wouldn't run, and then Reverend King was assassinated in Memphis in April. Bobby Kennedy called for calm, but riots broke out in 100 cities. 2 months later, Robert Kennedy was murdered on July 5th. My graduation ceremonies from Michigan State were held that sad Sunday. It was the day after tearful mourners lined the tracks of Bobby's funeral train. Well, it seemed that the world had gone crazy for good, and the good old days were gone once and for all. It was a hell of a time to turn 21, but at least I could legally drink, but I've always been more of a space cowboy anyway. In August, the Democratic National Convention, the Chicago police busted the heads of anti-war protesters, but by then, I was safe on the tip of North Africa, in Tunisia, because everybody my age wanted a deferment to stay out of Vietnam. I decided that my best bet was to join the Peace Corps for 2 years. That was the legacy that President Kennedy had left. It's my passable French, I guess, that got me into Tunisia, but that's where I ate couscous. I learned a little bit of Arabic. I taught English as a second language to kids who really couldn't care less, and I made some lifelong friends. All of us were grateful to be out of the chaos that was engulfing the U.S. Ironic how the past serves as a prelude to the present. Those 2 years were simple ones, living on the Mediterranean. I did call home twice, and my parents sent me blue aerograms and care packages filled with popcorn and peanut butter. They gave us Peace Corps volunteers a nice big locker full of very heady books, and I read quite a few of them. That was to make up for the lack of radio and television, which was all in Arabic. So it was at that time that I read Marshall McLuhan's The Medium is the Message and Understanding Media, and I decided I wanted to be a part of that transformation that television was surely having on society. I figured that naively, just connecting everybody up with technology would surely bring peace and prosperity to everybody, but things haven't exactly worked out that way yet, have they? Maybe the road to hell is paved with good intentions. On July 20th, 1969, a moon landing was broadcast worldwide. And then when I finished the Peace Corps service in 1970, I was a 23-year-old, eager to start a career in electronic media, whatever that meant, fueled only by my ambition and my ignorance, because not by any experience, because education courses in media, they hadn't been invented yet. On to the maple leaves. That August, I decided to immigrate to Montreal, where I soon discovered that Quebec French sounds très différent from the Parisian brand. N'est-ce pas? I landed a job thanks to some very kind people and kindness of strangers and a lot of luck at a $50 a week gopher job from 2 Jewish Hungarian filmmaker refugees in Westmount. I started to work my way up in the film business there, first at Mel Hoppenheim's Panavision rental outfit. And that's where I worked under his camera tech, Fritz, he was absolutely the nicest Nazi that I had ever worked with, then or since, because Herr Fritz, very, very precise when it came to loading 16mm film into Aeroflex and Eclair cameras, and he had been drafted into Hitler's Youth Brigade at the end of the war, and managed to survive and immigrated to Canada, a country that gave us both fresh starts. Well, I learned the ropes, how to be an assistant cameraman, lugging tripods, film stock, lights and lenses all over the country for the National Film Board on the kinds of feature-length documentaries that they had pioneered in Canada at the NFB since 1922. I remember on one month-long shoot, we followed a local circus that you can still see, High Grass Circus on YouTube, around rural Ontario. We were living in Winnebagos. And it was nominated for an Academy Award in 1977. On another NFB shoot on forests, I was in charge of the equipment as we hit 22 different locations in 30 days, from the tip of Newfoundland to Inuvik, way up in the Arctic Circle. Well, in my 20s, I learned an awful lot about the second largest country in the world, where insulin, the telephone, IMAX, and snowmobiles, and a lot more, were also invented. 41 million people today, more or less multicultural, hoping to hold Confederation together despite the unexpected reset with a powerful bully south of the 49th parallel. Well, I saved enough money to spend the brutal 1973 Montreal winter traveling to India and Nepal for 4 months, a quest that ignited my continued interest in Eastern wisdom and meditation. So let's all take a breath. By 1975, I began to move from behind the cameras in front of a microphone at the old CBC Tower on Dorchester Street near Old Montreal. I can remember my first news story that I was asked to write. The assignment editor handed me a pile of teletype news copy and said, give me a 20-second reader on the International Air Transport Convention. Well, obviously, it is impossible to boil down a 3-day convention into 20 seconds, right? So Back and forth, I went all morning until finally I did learn how to simplify things and then put it into a pyramid style and then find more or less a catchy lead. Be bold, be brief, be gone. Obviously something that I've long forgotten. Well, then I started on air, probably because my Yankee accent wasn't too drawn out. And I learned how to say and about and lieutenant and schedule instead of schedule. So that got me on the radio, and I got a contract interviewing on a nightly arts program on CBC called Nightcap, thanks to Deborah Weinstein, who later founded a very successful PR agency in Toronto called Strategic Objectives. Since I'm, name dropping, I interviewed artists like John McLaughlin, Stanley Turrentine, Jim Carrey, Wayne Shorter, Leonard Cohen, Donald Sutherland. Sorry, but Justin Bieber and Seth Rogen, they were in diapers at the time. So. I managed to land a job as a staff announcer at the CBC, following in the footsteps of Alex Trebek, Peter Jennings, Keith Morrison, my wife's favorite, who filling in occasionally for Knowlton Nash and Peter Mansbridge on The National. Some of you remember. The CBC venerated the BBC with a very high bar and a mandate to inform, enlighten, and entertain. And we all tried to reflect diversity and national identity and serve as a standard of journalistic integrity, values that I still hold very dear. An audition that is embarrassingly amateur to watch today got me an offer for an anchor position in Charlottetown, PEI, in Prince Edward Island, and 8 miles out in the Northumberland Strait and the St. Lawrence River. That's when you had to take a ferry to get there, because it was 20 years before they built the big bridge. I said, hey, why not? What's the downside? They said, well, the winters can be a little long, and you will be on an island, but it's the home of Anne of Green Gables, with lots of lobsters and potatoes. And indeed, Bud the Spud and Anne Murray were very popular. Well, my new wife and I drove to the Maritimes, where we survived 2 winters, although the marriage did not. I did a half-hour noon radio program, and it anchored at 6 and 10, very, very local news on the lobster and cod fisheries, the potato harvest, and local church events on Sunday. And of course, always the weather. In February of '82, a blizzard paralyzed PEI for a month, 2 feet of snow, temperatures 30 degrees below zero, and for 2 weeks, only snowmobiles moved. But that close-knit community stuck together, and there was nothing like local news. But sadly, it's vanishing all too quickly today. Yet another audition brought me an offer to move to Toronto, the good. The CBC building on Jarvis Street was an old girls' school, a warren of little offices at the time. I did a high school quiz show called Reach for the Top, and then there was the glitzy coming attractions, as well as the regular TV and radio newscasts, depending on the shift. Over on Parliament Street in Toronto, I co-hosted an afternoon drive radio program. Call-in talk radio at the time was a blast before controversy took over. Every day I learned something just by trying it, just by doing it. Great Canadian journalists like Morley Safer and Peter Jennings and PBS's Robert McNeil already were household names in the US, and I took out citizenship in Canada in 1983. I figured, hey, I'd be going the other way. Little did I know. Anchorman of the 80s. One chilly afternoon in Toronto, I stepped out of the shower to answer a phone call. News director Tim Gardner in Austin said he'd seen my tape. He wondered if I wanted to play championship news ball in Central Texas, there, deep in the heart of Texas at KTBC, where Lyndon founded the station and where Lady Bird actually still lived on the 4th floor. My parents retired in San Antonio, and so I said yes. I headed south to a more commercial media landscape, anchoring for the CBS affiliate at 5, 6, and 10. Now, one downside of having been a local somebody somewhere is that on YouTube you are forever haunted by the horror of how you used to look. And I'll never forget, after our daughter Haley saw an old tape of mine, she said, "Oh gee, Dad, you used to be good looking." Thank you, sweetie. We all did, right? So after 2 years in Austin, another news director, Stan, called to ask if I'd be interested in moving from a 62 market to a number 6 at WBZ in big-time Boston. My agent said my salary was going to double on a 3-year contract, so I accepted. I drove up the East Coast thinking, hey, this is too good to be true. And you know what? It was. In the 1968 election, Dukakis got trounced by George Bush Sr. WBZ was overstaffed, and frankly, I wasn't really ready for the fast pace of Beantown news. So at the end of my first year, Stan, the man, fresh out of substance rehab, wished me very well in my future endeavors. I forgot to mention that 3-year contract had options after each year. So my adventurous, soon-to-be spouse, Kim, and I crammed our belongings into a storage locker in Arlington and piled our camping gear into an Isuzu Trooper. And kind of like Jack Kerouac from nearby Lowell, we went on the road for 9 months, driving 16,000 miles around the United States on our savings and camping in national parks. From Canada to Texas, California, to Florida, and then back to Austin. We did odd jobs and got married on a shoestring, if that. It was really from bright lights to big city to, sleeping on a roommate's floor on a mattress. Fortunately, though, my agent was still Shirley Barris. She was still looking around for me. First, I flew east into blustery Albany, New York, then out west to Santa Maria, California. And you know what? The difference between snow-covered bare trees and waving palm trees, it made the decision really a no-brainer. So budgets were always tight, and I enterprised some stories. Before the 1992 Winter Olympics in France, I wrangled tickets from Lufthansa for a week shoot in the Alps to bring back material for the ratings. Features was what made doing the news fun. A package on a B-26 bomber, or setting up for a stomach-churning ride on an F-16. Pretty unforgettable. We had a weekly segment of financial advice. One day the local financial guru pitched me the idea of becoming a stockbroker for Dean Witter. Who? Me? I didn't know anything about finance, but since ignorance had never been an obstacle before, I left KCOY. I passed the Series 7 exam, trained at the Twin Towers, and built what I thought surely was going to be a huge book of business. But I discovered that making money as a stockbroker is much easier if your friends are millionaires. And besides, the very affable Ed Murray down the hall, he had all the ag business in Santa Maria wrapped up. He was a scratch golfer on the Santa Maria course where he often played golf with his brother Bill. Yeah, the Caddyshack actor, Bill Murray. And I almost met Bill once at a wedding, but that's uncool in California. Early one morning, I was making phone calls when I heard about an opening at the #1 Austin station, anchoring with Judy Maggio on KView. That was the town I left 5 years earlier. My career in finance was going nowhere, so loaded with the optimism and invention that only sheer desperation can bring, I put my best self forward and got the job. In July of '94, just after OJ drove his white Bronco down the LA freeways, Kim and I piled our squirming 3-year-old in a car seat that she definitely did not like for a 3-day drive to the heart of Texas. Well, part of the fanfare of introducing a new anchor involved flying us to Washington to shoot promos with Peter Jennings and Hugh Downs and Barbara Walters and Ted Koppel. All of them were very, very gracious and short and sweet with their U.S. affiliate cousins. Ted Koppel was especially. he ushered us into his conference room and then politely asked us, please remove all your clothes, before he smiled at his ice-breaking joke. Well, I had a bad cold from travel, but before we left D.C., I managed to visit the Vietnam Memorial to locate my high school friend, Jack Schneider, among the 58,318 names engraved in granite there. Jack had joined the Marines in '64 and broke our young hearts a year later when he came back in a closed casket. My Semper Fi cousin, Pat Fowler, made it home okay, but he was tormented by PTSD before that even had a name. Looking back now, I think my generation, we tried to do what we thought was right during that bloody conflict, and some people like me were a lot luckier than others. Maybe as Bob Dylan sang, it is just a simple twist of fate. Well, to wrap things up, the 80s were a very transformative decade in television news. Lightweight cameras, mobile satellite trucks operated from everywhere. CNN came on the air in 1980. Cable news, computer graphics, satellite maps started to visually enhance the medium. Reagan deregulated ownership limits, allowing corporate consolidation. News operations then turned into profit centers and shifted to live image-driven event coverage. And in 1987, the FCC eliminated the fairness doctrine that required broadcasters to prevent controversial issues in a fair and balanced manner. So here we are today in what some would call a toxic cesspool of half-truths unleashed by social media with 8 billion people and 8 billion cell phones. But as democracy backslides, I like to remind myself and you of the value of a free press, because freedom of expression is enshrined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, also in the Constitución Política de los Estados Unidos Mexicanos, and most broadly of all, in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. But too much of a good thing isn't always a good thing. That is my opinion. But it's a fact that for 500 years, the free press has been the backstop against tyranny. Today, I find myself agreeing with Republican Governor Cox of Utah's call to log off, turn off, touch grass, hug a family member, and do good in your community. Well, by 1996, my volatile romance with a boob tube had withered. I turned 5 with a 5-year-old. I was working second shift from 1:30 to 10:30. I wasn't interested in overtime. I was friends with a handsome 5 o'clock USC graduate anchor who had all the energy and enthusiasm of a 30-year-old. One day we met for breakfast, and he gave me the lowdown. He said management was going to pay out my contract, put him in the anchor chair. Now, those of you from Austin, 30 years later, you can watch my friend Walt Macaborski still going strong on the Fox affiliate in Austin with 3 grown sons as he approaches his 60th milestone. I never quit a business that everybody thought was so darn exciting, but I was hugely relieved. I was tired of being a bad news bear without offering any solutions to problems. So, as before, one door closed, another one opened. I bootstrapped myself into